Nice to meet Karen Murray.
Yeah, Karen Danforth.
Nice to meet you.
Good
Get ready
evening.
to start. Oh.
Can you hear me? Yes. Sounds like a commercial we've all seen. I'm Ron Ward. I'm Assistant Monitor with the U.S. District Court Monitoring Team. I just want to thank you so much for your hospitality and for having us here this evening to talk about the consent decree in Seattle involving the Seattle Police Department. What we're going to have here via the miracle of technology, Merrick Bobb, nationally and internationally known expert on police consent decrees, form measures, best police practices, and is the head of the of PARC. As you can see, I'm showing the first signs of the season. I couldn't even talk yesterday. This is a vast improvement. I want you to give a special welcome to my colleague, Matthew Barge. Matthew is Deputy Director of PARC, graduate of NYU Law School, worked at a couple of major law firms on the East Coast, decided to return to police assessment and came back to the West Coast. He still lives in New York. He actually came through Seattle tonight from New York here to address you. So please give a warm welcome to Matthew Barge.
I first want to thank you for being here and to Columbia Legal Services for their warm hospitality. As you all, in September 2012, the U.S. Department of Justice and City of Seattle entered into a consent decree addressing the Seattle Police Department. And that stemmed from an investigation that the Department of Justice conducted, which concluded that the SPD had engaged in an unconstitutional pattern and practice of excessive force. And the investigation also raised some very serious concerns related to discriminatory practices, namely patterns and practices related to pedestrian encounters. Merrick, who is my boss, the executive director of the Police Assessment Resource Center, was appointed federal monitor by federal judge James Robart to serve as his independent agent to oversee the implementation of the consent decree and at some point in the future recommend to the court when the department has reached full and effective compliance with the agreement, that they've done all of the things they were supposed to do and has seen the changes implemented that they were supposed to see. So we are about 2 years into the process, and as I think Merrick is going to tee up in the video here, shot from somewhere that's substantially nicer weather, I noted when I looked at things here today. I think he's going to tee up for you sort of some of the major issues that we've seen, the progress that we've made, the many challenges that still await us in the process. So I've learned one thing, which is always to never on the boss's toes. So I'm going to let him introduce what we're doing in his own words, and then we can talk a little bit more specifically about exactly where we're at right now in the process.
Hello, my name is Merrick, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I wish I could be with you in Seattle, but you can see I'm at home in Southern California, but sending you a message with warm regards. As you may know already, I am the monitor appointed by Federal Judge James Robart to monitor the consent decree that was entered into between the City of Seattle and the United States Department of Justice in July of 2012. Later that year, the judge had the authority to monitor, oversee implementation consent decree, and with the eventual agreement of the parties, my name was presented to Judge Robart, who interviewed me and ultimately selected me. The consent itself deals with two main topics. The first is excessive force. The Justice Department conducted an investigation in 2011, led to a set of findings concluding that the Seattle Police Department engaged in a pattern or practice of excessive force. That meant that the Justice Department was prepared to file a lawsuit and go to trial if necessary to establish those facts and to seek relief. Injunctive relief was possible because in 1994, in the wake of the Rodney King matter, the Congress passed laws that allowed the Justice Department to bring actions against pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. This was a newly won power by the Department, and they began to investigate and then bring actions in a number of different cities, including Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, and Detroit, and a number of others. Consent decrees require that the entity, the Seattle Police Department in this particular case, get into full effective compliance, or sometimes called substantial compliance, with the consent decree. That means they have established patterns and practices such that the risk of excessive force is measured and managed. It's what the Seattle Police Department is doing now. And working with the monitor, the parties came up with a use of force policy for the department that is consistent with constitutional standards. Again, working with the department, we came up with guidelines for how the police should handle traffic stops and how they should be taking steps to assure themselves that we do not have any biased or discriminatory policing going on here in Seattle. The consent decree covers those and many other topics. It addresses the relationship between the SPD and people who are in behavioral crisis by way of mental health or drugs or whatever the cause may be, and to come up with a series of ways to respond to those individuals that raise less of a risk that force will have to be employed, and in particular deadly force. This is now within the Department analysis and review of use of force. Now every use of force within the department is recorded, and it is reviewed by a supervisor, a set of supervisors, and up the chain of command. They are tasked with, ultimately, the file goes to the Force Review Board, and this is a board that is made up of police experts from all the different sides of the department. All the precincts are represented. The training department is represented, and so forth. At those proceedings, the board takes apart use of force and considers it from all different angles, looking at the particular incident from the time that the officers were dispatched all the way through to the end when an arrest is made, and trying to figure out whether a force was employed, it was done pursuant to policy and was constitutional, or whether there were some problems with respect to the use of force, and then what should be done about it. The monitoring has proceeded now for 2 years. What happens is that the department needs a point where it's in full and effective the consent decree, as found by the federal judge. Then there will be 2 more years in which the department must maintain that level of compliance. And if they do so, then the time will be ripe to dissolve the decree. This gives you, I think, understanding of what the consent decree is, what the monitor does, and I know that the people there from the team are going to be happy to answer your questions and fill you in a little better on what I've only had a few minutes to do. In the meantime, I wish you all my best, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you.
So what that do is, as Merrick says, just sort of update you with a little bit more specificity as to where the department is, the progress that it's made, and some of the challenges it still faces. So turning to the area of use of force, as Merrick noted, one of the things that the judge approved, the first thing that the department and the Department of Justice worked very hard on was a new use of force policy. It makes very clear some commitments to new values that the SPD hadn't had before, namely a commitment to de-escalation, to where feasible and consistent with officer and community safety, to employ strategic communication tactics, other sort of strategies and approaches that might give the officer more physical space, might sort of diffuse situations that are becoming more stressful. The officer should be proportional to that threat. Obviously, that's not an occasion for an officer-involved shooting or the use of a taser. That there needs to be some sort of equivalence there. The force policies have, in some of the local press accounts, been bandied about as an unwieldy 88-page document. When you hear that, you should be very suspicious because it's not true. What tells the officer to do what they should do out there, on the streets, is about 4 pages. The rest of the documentation has to do with bureaucracies, like a lot, and is very important for reasons I'll get to. How you report and how supervisors respond to the scene, how incidents are reviewed and investigated. That's all very important, but it's not something that officers need to necessarily keep in mind when they're responding to an emerging situation. So it provides officers with very clear guidance and much clearer expectations, frankly, old use of force used to give them about what they should do, how they should respond, and what is and is not appropriate and consistent with the department and the community's values. As I said, another sort of set of materials that were filed at the same time, the other 84 pages, with a very different regime for the department to operate under with respect to internal investigations of officers using force. When the Department of Justice did its investigation, one of the things they reported was that they couldn't actually find, in many instances, where the paperwork documenting that an officer had used force was. And if there was documentation, it was sort of tossed into a filing cabinet, often never looked at again. What these policies are is that every use of force is rigorous. that there's follow-up and cross-reference to ensure that that actually is taking place, and that activates, as Merrick said, a very defined process for the review and investigation of that force. If force is compared to level, which is it's categorized within the force policies, sort of certain class of force, and that's based on things like injury inflicted onto the subject, the general, weapon or maneuver that an officer used, a whole host of factors, which are set forth clearly. If that categorization indicates that it's a fairly low force, then those sorts of view board, which is really kind of the hub and nucleus for the department to consider and analyze in a critical fashion what officers are doing with respect to force. Not just to say whether what the officer was doing was right or wrong, or was consistent with the law or policy or not, but to actively learn from the incident. To ask themselves, what does this say about our tactics, our training, our policies and procedures, that even if the technically legal constitutional principles, what might have that would have created a different outcome? What might we do differently to train officers when a doctor might go and present a particularly thorny case in front of, a board at a hospital and get asked tough questions, even when they ultimately did everything that they could in a certain instance? Nonetheless, to sort of field those tough questions, we sort of view the Force Review Board in a similar light, where an officer's fellow officers and supervisors are really going to ask tough questions and give scrutiny to an officer's performance. So that's sort of one class of force review. Another is for the more serious incidents where a significant force instrument was used, where there was injury to a subject, that kind of thing. In instances, the department has created a dedicated force investigation team. It used to be that basically generic SPD detectives conducted internal investigations of SPD officers. They don't really have any expertise in conducting these sorts of investigations, let alone investigations that would give the department a whole picture of everything that led up to the force, and not just sort of what happened at the moment that an officer struck someone with a baton, taser, or that kind of thing. And what this force investigation is trained to do is to ask the officer and witnesses questions that try to determine, as I just said, not sort of whether the force might have been technically legal at the moment, rather what choices and decisions did the officer made that led up to the, and how could those have potentially been different? Should the officer have done something different according to training or other policies and that kind of thing? And this force investigation team will work up inquiry and then hand that off to the review board for adjudication in the way that I just described. That's just a generic snapshot of the framework SPD now has with respect to force. That's very different from paper not being filled out or being filled out and shoved in a drawer somewhere. It's not to say that everything is perfect. The force investigators still are needing to get up to speed a little bit on making sure that the questions are rigorous and that they are using questioning techniques that aren't leading, that they are exhausting all avenues and inquiry of kind of thing. It's an ongoing process. The Force Review Board itself is still getting to the point where they can affirmatively and proactively all of the tough issues. We're there every week. Them themselves, we raise them at this point, but we want to get them to a point where they are comfortable in asking their own officers the tough questions all the time, regardless of the facts and that sort of thing. Toggling just briefly to, a few more words on force first. Obviously, it's one thing to have good policies, but officers need to know what they are and to have received practical training in sort of these more nebulous concepts of de-escalation and proportionality. So all SPD officers, by the end of the year at least, will have gone through some 32 hours training on. This is, there's a heavy emphasis on dealing with individuals in crisis with mental health issues, drugs, and that kind of thing, as well as an emphasis on de-escalation. How do you do it? I was just talking with one of our colleagues today about a case that he had come across in which the officer involved was making the assertion when interviewed by folks that, in his view, de-escalating the situation after he had engaged in sort of a hard strike to the subject's body was putting them in handcuffs. That is not necessarily what we're talking about. It's the things that come before the need for force that's de-escalation. So there's clearly training that is still left to be done on that front, and indeed we're sort of finishing up reaching an agreement with the department on what training officers should receive in 2015, and there was a substantial commitment that the department is making to training on just these areas of de-escalation, of tactical communication, of and procedures that officers on the street in real incidents to affect different outcomes. And there's going to be at least 2 real officer performance on the streets. Very briefly, and then I'll let Ron fill in anything I might have missed, and then want to primarily hear from you, not only your questions, but your comments, your concerns, hear about your experiences as many of you are intimately involved with many of these issues. But I want to touch on the area of discriminatory policing and disparate impacts with respect to pedestrian encounters and the like. This is an area that is topical. It's gotten a lot of national attention, especially recently. There is not, in some ways, a gold standard for how to address these issues. So we are trying to comb through what academics, other law enforcement agencies, and the Department of Justice and that sort of thing have to say about how you address these patterns and how you balance the need to clearly avoid disparate impacts while at the same time ensuring that you don't get constitutional policing by having cops do no policing. The first way we did that was to, again, start with policy and to codify with some precision exactly what the effects officers will do, what basis officers will have when they initiate an encounter with a civilian. We found that initially there was a lot of confusion among officers as to what the differences were between a social contact and a Terry stop. And so, the policies make very clear what the differences are, and the trainings make even more clear. And officers are currently receiving training, literally as we speak, in a very intensive way. It makes clear what those differences are, what that officers need reasonable suspicion solely on external characteristics alone, or the sort of nebulous connection of someone who looks a certain way in a certain neighborhood at a certain time, but actually specific articulable facts support a specific reasonable suspicion of a person, and that's the grounds for stop. The policies make that clear, the training makes that clear. Hand in hand with those policies is a new policy on bias-free policing. It makes a commitment, the department in it makes a commitment to ensuring that any complaints of bias by civilians are investigated, that a supervisor responds to a scene, that they are tracked, that they are adjudicated fully and fairly, and that the department trends in the that if an officer has a disproportionate number of complaints vis-a-vis his peers in the bias area, even regardless of adjudication, that the department is considering maybe what that means. Perhaps that officer needs some further training or assistance in sort of communications and sort of everyday tactics. So that policy is admittedly in some areas a little bit nebulous, but it puts some meat on the bones by requiring that supervisors respond to instances where there's a complaint, however that complaint comes in, at the scene, or later on the supervisor is immediately forwarded it. Someone goes to OPA or just walks into a precinct and said, I had this encounter, and and believe it to be unfair. Provides very clear mechanisms by which the department has to analyze their data, which is an independent challenge. But when they have good, rigorous data on who they're stopping, it can't just sit. The department needs to analyze it, and when it identifies trends that suggest that, with respect to stops, for example, that there are disparate impacts, that there are disproportionate trends, that's not in and of itself good enough. They have to ask themselves why, how come, what could they maybe be doing differently, and that sort of thing. So that sort of, as initial nexus in policy, has aimed to address those issues. Officers are being trained in that. With respect to this front, I hope that if you go over to the SPD and ask around to officers and say, hey, are you racist? I'm going to hope that they are going to say, no, I'm not racist, I'm not biased. And that leads to an unfortunate situation when you try to offer training on this bias-free policing policy. You have a lot of officers who come into a classroom, sit in the back with their arms folded, and say, well, this isn't me, I'm good, I have a commitment to diversity and equality and all those good things. And there is, I think, as many people in this room know, a very robust literature on implicit bias, that even though you say that you're committed to equality and have those sort of values, nonetheless, fast-moving situations be a subconscious a thing at play. Unfairly link race with crime and that sort of thing, shape our immediate, spur-of-the-moment, instinctive decision-making. And so there's some Department of Justice sponsored on introducing those concepts of implicit bias and subconscious bias, and officers are sort of being trained on sort of introduced to those concepts and being given sort of a toolkit for ways of slowing down situations, of being deliberative in their processes and that kind of thing, to try to mitigate those effects. But one of the things that's interesting about this area, a little bit unsatisfying but interesting, is that sort of the number one thing the literature finds is can sort of start to effects of implicit bias in the real world is simple awareness, having received training, being familiar that this might be influencing your immediate reactions or split-second decision-making. And so, we are hoping that this sort of training is an important first step, but officers will continue to receive, additional training in these sorts of areas, focusing, I think, increasingly in 2015 on strategic communication, understanding how to interact in potentially different ways according to different folks. Different of the communities in Seattle have different sorts of cultural backgrounds that may lead them to respond to police in different or unfamiliar ways to officers, and giving some guidance to officers on that, informed by collaborations with various community groups that the SPD is moving toward as well. There are a number of other areas on. The department is implementing some pretty significant computer technology systems, which it doesn't sound very exciting on the surface, but we live in an age of big data and of sort of using data to guide management and to support decision making. The SPD is probably still 15 to 20 years behind where most other law enforcement agencies are with respect to gathering data that's good data and to actually using it to manage officer performance, to to try to mitigate the risk of unconstitutional policing. So we're trying to also ensure that supervisors are not just making decisions about how somebody is doing out there based on gut instinct or reputation, or oh, she's great, or he's a good guy, but rather really have consider a rigorous accounting of what officers are doing and how their performance is in the field. That will inform, in part, a very formalized where supervisors will be required to intervene, part of an early intervention system, to intervene with officers who have reached certain thresholds of behavior. If you've had so many officer-involved shootings or so many uses of force, there's a trigger that sort of compels supervisors to do something, to look at your whole performance and see if you might be having might be engaged in a problematic sort of trend that the department needs to reverse ahead affirmatively of problems. A long way to go with respect to these computer systems, with the EIS system, on the core issues with respect to force. As I said, it takes a while to move a department that's not used to critically self-analyzing what they do to where they are now, which is that I think they are how aggressive they can be with respect to questioning other officer actions. So I think week by week, step by step, they're starting to get there, but they still have a ways to go. And as I said, there's a lot of very important training started and will continue to give officers the kind of practical skills that they need to translate the policy into practice. Ron, would you add anything here?
I want to apologize because I'm going to have to leave shortly. I have a speaking engagement this evening at the North Seattle District Advisory Council Precinct. North Seattle, as you know, is the precinct out of which SPD officers launched a federal lawsuit against this process, and specifically with regard to the use of force policies. So I'm going to be leaving to go out there in a little. Matthew I really love working with him. He has an encyclopedic grasp of this area. He's very comprehensive. He is comprehensive in terms of his articulation of the issues here tonight. I want to say this past 2 years, we've been a part of a often contentious, very arduous process. That shouldn't be you. It took a long time to get to the point where 33 community agencies petitioned the United States Department of Justice to come in and do a pattern and practices investigation in the aftermath of the death of John T. Williams. We do believe that there are tremendous challenges remaining, but there has been great progress. Matthew pointed out in particular this new use of analysis and process. It used to be that the only analysis was at the point the agent pulled the trigger, the act occurred. That's not the case anymore. The entire episode or scenario is being looked at from the very outset. What was the officer thinking? What sorts of events transpired which led to this particular aspect of the event? Did the officer provoke the situation? Did the officer attempt to de-escalate the situation? And it's not just the officer who is at issue. Our system becomes a part of this process because the board is specifically looking to see if there are lessons to be learned that implicate policy for the better for the entire. That's a vast improvement over what was existent before. up until John T. Williams was killed, I arrived here in 1978. Before then and since then, there had never been a finding that an unlawful use of force was out of policy or use of force. No officer involved shooting was ever found to be out of policy. In the past 2 to 3 months, the Use of Force Review Board has found at least 2 instances of use of force being out of policy. And this is officers involved with that board. It took a lot to get them to the point where they began to think critically, to think analytically in that fashion, and most of all, to have to step up and say, this is something that shouldn't have happened, this is policy, this is something that the rest of the department can learn from. This is going to continue a tough process. The LA Police Department was under a consent decree for 14 years. Took Cincinnati there a bit more quickly, but this process is going to be around for a while. The thing for people, you read certain things in the newspaper and you wonder, are we really affecting any change at all? The answer is yes. But the thing for you to keep in mind is that ultimately, this is culture. Culture on the part of these officers, culture on the part of the community. We can get to the point where we have a perfect implementation of the consent decree and wake up the next morning, look in the mirror and say we failed if we haven't formed a new relationship between the community and the police based on respect and dignity. It sounds idealistic, it sounds lofty, it sounds trite, but that's the reality. That's the actuality of how you get people to a new place in terms of the quality of life, particularly in a major urban metropolitan center. We've been accused of being anti-police. Nothing could be further from the truth. These police officers, male and female, for the most part, are trying to do their job. And they're trying to do it in an upright manner. They put that badge on in the morning. Sometimes if they leave in the dark and their kids are asleep, they never know whether they're going to get back to them. They deal with a lot of pressures. They deal with a lot of danger. So this isn't about canonization of the citizen of the police. It is about developing a relationship which leads to a better quality of life, more safety for everybody in Seattle. That's why we continue to show up every day in these meetings with the Department of Justice, with the City Attorney's Office, with SPD. It's very much the dereliction of our practices. I know my clients often call and wonder, where is he and what is he doing? Well, this is what I've been doing for the past 2 years and what I hope to continue to do until we get to the point where we have an environment in Seattle that we all believe is acceptable, that we all believe is constitutional, that we all believe is consistent with the rule of law.
So with that, your questions and comments are primarily why we're here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You cover some ground about what is happening in terms of account one's force exists, to the extent that Ron raises a very important issue with regard to context and prevention and trust and respect and building a different kind of culture. To what extent is the monitoring program addressing those kind of prevention issues? So to what extent, and I know that there's training and about bias and this and that, but bringing the community together and of the police department to actually engage on a different level. What are some models perhaps that you guys are looking at?
Merrick strongly believes that all of the kind of initiatives and objectives that I outlined in some detail earlier are solely in service of ensuring that folks in Seattle, all folks, regardless of community, race, sexual orientation, etc., have confidence and trust in the police department readily with that, but it's very hard to operationalize, to break it down and say what does the department need to do first, who do they need to sort of bring to the table and engage to get there. I think a few things are happening which are encouraging on that front. One is that Chief Kathleen O'Toole, who's just been on the job for not so long now, one of the first things she was for her folks in the precincts to prepare neighborhood policing plans, not sort of broad swaths of the city, but really kind of micro communities, communities that make sense based on where people are and who is represented in those places, to try to figure out with some precision what are we doing there, what should we be doing there, who are we connecting and not connecting with, and how do we shift resources around to do a better job on that front. I think they're still in the early days of implementing, those plans, of translating it from paper into practice. But I think that's a lot more than had ever been done previously within the department, to try to recognize that community policing isn't just sort of fabulously with the community, but is actually, going into real communities, real cross sections, and engaging. Chief has also been out a tremendous amount with folks like the mayor time, walking neighborhoods. Folks, what's going on here? The chief has recounted a few stories where she's gone out with pretty high-ranking SPD folks and simply seen what was going on. Are there officers policing out there? Are they standing around, or are they interacting with people? Assessment, at sort of a first-hand look in what officers are doing, on their own time when they're out on patrol, to try to develop the sorts of that could really benefit, the department. Another thing that I missed not to include is that this was one of the first degrees nationally that and this is right at the top of the document. It's not like light reading, so I don't recommend it for a nice beach read. But if you picked it up, one of the very first things it addresses is the creation of a community police commission, the CPC, which has volunteer commissioners appointed by the mayor, and that's really intended to serve as a forum for community groups to come together with the SPD and its officers, and to sort of be a point of ongoing partnership and collaboration. The CPC was involved, for example, in the creation of this bias-free policing training. They are actually participating in the training. Those commissioners, who represent a very diverse array of communities in Seattle, are actually going physically to the trainings and giving a 20-minute presentation on what the CPC does, but more importantly, why they care about these issues, how the SPD has historically affected them, their communities, and how issues related to procedural justice and sort of fairness and equity have played out in their own lives. And we saw sort of a prototype of this training, and I have to say that was probably one of the more powerful junctures of the training. It gets it out from these very nebulous concepts that can be squishy to sort of having officers get a first-hand look as to how in one instance someone has they're not getting paid to go in there. These commissioners really, I think, believe strongly in and want to affect positive change by sharing what really comes across. So I think we feel pretty strongly, I feel especially, that this concept of community policing is something everybody, because it's a lot of nice words usually, be operationalized, and there needs to be a commitment on the institutional level, certainly, but in very sustained ways on the micro levels in small sort of communities with officers using their time differently on patrol and that kind of thing, to really effectuate it in practice. And that's something that I think the department has just begun and is going to need a lot more time to do.
But that's also a part
of the consent decree. The department, unless they can demonstrate that they have in effect accomplished those goals, cannot reach full and effective compliance. They have goals in order to achieve substantial compliance. And of course, coupled with that are other things, with stops and detentions. Everyone, I think, here is familiar with what evolved in New York with the stop at New York Police Department. Stops and detentions right now, one of the things we're pushing for is to create a situation in which an officer who stops an individual must document that stop every time in the future so that it can be scrutinized. One of the great things about data is it allows you to track people. It acts as an early warning system. It allows you to go back and historically look events, compare them with contemporary events, and see what you get when you do that kind of analysis. Something that is a force in terms of accountability. And what we're talking about first, before we get to any of the rest of this, when we talk about use of force, when we talk about free policing, when we talk about crisis intervention, when we talk about stops and detentions, when we talk about performance mentoring and monitoring of officers, what we're talking about first is accountability. Without accountability, there's nothing. Once you get to the point where you have accountability, then you can continue, you can shift your resources into this area of relationships between the police and the community. Accountability is going to vastly help that respect and dignity kind of dynamic you're attempting to incorporate here. Just the same in-car video and body cameras. We are big proponents of in-car video and body cameras because if you look at where pilot projects have been done around the country, precipitous declines and unlawful use of force, both by police and citizens. Something about that camera, when somebody knows they're on that camera, it changes their behavior, it changes the way that they move, the way that they react, the way that they carry themselves. So all of this is a multifaceted kind of dynamic. These things are going to be necessary, and they're going to take time, and they're going to be hard. And everybody's going to have to be involved. Seattle's on the cusp of some dramatic changes. And if those changes are going to be coupled with the quality of life, we're all going to have to be involved with these changes. There's no two ways about it.
Thank you, Ron. I won't be nearly as articulate without you here.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Did others have questions?
I have a question.
please.
So what are procedures are going to be done to rebuild the trust in the community? Because I think, especially in the African community, the trust is been broken. And before you can deal with the accountability, we have to build back up the trust in the police in these areas of not only just African Americans, but all minority. There has been a breakdown in the relationship between the people and the police. How do you build that back up first to even deal with the accountability of essential?
I agree with you. Yeah, what I would say a few things. First, I think down in trust. So we did a very exhaustive survey, pretty early, of sort of statistically valid survey, and sort of got a pretty good slice of Seattle. And what was really interesting to me is that overall there was general approval of the department's ability to do law enforcement to solve crimes and that type of stuff. But a really sizable percentage, regardless of race, said that the department doesn't treat people that have problems with discriminatory policing. Of course, I mean, like, we're talking like 60-70% style numbers. And, it wasn't just people who had been personally hit, it was really across the community. And that really, stuck out at me. But I mean, then the numbers, when you went into the African American community, Latino community, other, the Native American community, I mean, those numbers were really significant. Severe lack of trust and, on some very basic dimensions. And, the one thing, that I think we noted is that, a lot of sort of roundtable discussions about how there is a problem, were things that had been done around Seattle for a while, and there wasn't follow-up. There were a lot of reform efforts that hadn't really materialized in real progress. So we, I think the consent decree sort of compelled us to shift our, how do we get the department to a place where it's doing things differently, demonstrably, and partnering them about it, and having people experience it for themselves on the street that indicate that, hey, something's different here. They're treating folks differently. They are being transparent with us about when there was an officer involved shooting down the street. They're giving us information. They're telling us what they're investigating and what they're looking at, rather than telling us to go away, it's not your problem, right? I think that is, sort of showing people on a day-to-day basis that in some of these core areas like force, investigating what their own officers are doing, stopping people on the street, that sort of thing, a lot of the proof is in the pudding. So we're trying to spend a decent amount of time in making sure that the SPD isn't just talking about doing something differently, but they actually are, and that folks are feeling that, on the street, while at the same time doing some of the things I just mentioned. Recommitting to community policing, not just in principle, but as something that has steps, that have components that people are held accountable for actually doing, so that officers are incentivized, that you get promoted on the basis of how well you know the community that you're policing. And those are the sorts of things that, as I said, it's still going to take a while for the department to get there. But, we are optimistic that when we do another survey later on in the year, that there's going to be hopefully just a little movement, because some folks have said, hey, maybe there are a few things that are changing. But, I think the proof will, as I say, be a little bit in the pudding.
I think because I do the reentry program. I work with people with criminal backgrounds and talk to my clients about coming here and ask them head on, what are some questions you would like me to ask on the public? 99% was, when are we gonna, since there's a police chief, when are we gonna have community meetings where we can become involved? Because I think that the communities feel like they're involved. In many gatherings like this of different people, who don't live in these communities, because we're speaking about communities some of these people don't even live in. So if you don't live in a community, you can't identify with the problems that are going on in the community. And I think if they're really trying to rebuild relationships, the first place we need to start is actually having formal inside of the communities and getting them involved, inviting them out to ask questions and of different things that the Seattle Police Department can do to make it better in the community, so that when people see crime going on, they will feel comfortable to go and talk to the police and get involved in their neighborhoods and community. But you got to involve the people, and not just on paper, physically rebuilding the relationship from the ground up. And I think that's most of the things of the concern that I've gotten from the public, is they want to be involved. They want to meet the police chief. They want to know their views on the racial disparities of being stopped and arrest or walking down the street and, you know, an officer approaching them just because they're a person of color. But we gotta approach it, not.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, the one thing that I will note just from being over at the department a lot and interacting with her a lot, I think the chief hears that. I think she's heard that from where she's going, and she's rarely in her office. And I think that's a very good thing. It's different from what Seattle has had before. And I think, you know, again, it's been maybe 4 or 5, and I think she's shown a pretty good and sizable commitment to getting out and talking with folks. And she also, you know, this is a personal view, not one of the Department of Justice or anything. She listens a lot, and that matters.
Yeah.
I mean, you can just tell that she is really interested in what folks are saying and trying to repair some of those relationships. I think it takes a lot of time. It's taken a lot of time in places like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and Washington and LA that have been under these decrees. But I think we're more optimistic than we've had been for some time, because she is starting, you know, really to go out in an intensive way into the community, as you say, to engage these issues and listening.
May I just say something, just to add on to the lady that just talked about the community? I know that she has been at the churches, but the church is not where everybody is. And I think our concept sometimes is that when people say the community, they go directly to the church. And we have to be careful of that. And I think here, what she's saying is that there's more than just that. Because some people don't feel welcome anymore into what used to be home to a lot of people for various reasons.
No, and I you know, the monitoring team is, I mean, we go around to groups all the time, and the one thing I've told Ron is that, you know, we don't want to go to places that have the usual suspects and who shout the loudest.
Yeah.
I think we want to get people, you know, engaged who are affected by this and maybe interested in it, but who, you know, the usual folks. And so I will take that back to her, because I think that's very that is consistent with what we're trying to do and getting people aware of what we're doing here.
I'm from Chicago, and one of the things that we did there when they were really, and they still have major problems there, but one of the things is they went to the sources of a lot of this, down with the gang leaders in these cities and different things like that, because those are the roots. And we need somebody to do that here, you know, to get to the root of what's the problem as far as the crime and different things like that. So that would be one of my suggestions, is really getting to the root and speaking to some of those people, the people that have been overlooked, the people who do have criminal backgrounds and stuff like that, to see, not to change any laws, but just to see what difference there could be made. Because some of these kids can get saved before it come to that, but if it ain't no trust there, it's nothing.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Was there another question here? I just wanted to let you know, just in case you don't know, that here in this room we have perspectives of sort of what I would call intermediary. We have civil and criminal legal organizations here, as well as community organizations who work with various populations that, for example, Columbia works with, reentry programs. And so to the extent that here we are as representative organizations working with various communities in Seattle and the county, what is the goal, you think, what is the message to be carrying to our network, to the extent that we're intermediaries trying to actually you know, provide important services and collaborate with really I think, because what we have here is that sort of this larger complicated concept is the problem of race and poverty. And that's very much about what brings us here together. And some of the things that we are thinking about are things like racial impact statements and issues of juvenile justice, criminal justice, housing stability, employment discrimination, things like that. So to what extent, you know, I guess 2 questions. What should be the message that we carry to our networks and our client communities And number two, are there tools contemplated such as racial impact statements? By, for example, maybe the community that.
You know, I think that the general message that I would take is that this is not the SPD that was around 10 years ago. It's not a perfect police department by any stretch of the imagination, and they have a long way to go. But they've started to turn a corner, and that where it used to be that office things and it could be shoved in a filing cabinet or swept under the rug, there's a lot of stuff happening to make sure that isn't the case. And you know, all of these specific things feed into that a little bit. You know, making sure that, you know, incidents are videotaped, so that there's that kind of accountability. You know, making sure that, you know, these sorts of use of force incidents, all that stuff is documented. In order to address any problems in that, in what officers are doing, you have to know what your officers do. And for too long, the department didn't know, and so they could turn away and not have to address anything. And I think we've turned a corner where officers in the department, in my view, perhaps as evidenced by the fact that 120 suit up, are concerned by the fact that a new day has seemed to arrive and that there's a commitment from the upper echelon of the department to sort of changing how things are done. But I'd also communicate to your folks that there's a long way to go. You know, there's a change, but it hasn't reached all quarters, it hasn't reached all officers, and there are still a lot of officers who need to get the message, and who, perhaps may need to find other lines of work. And I think the folks you interact with should know that. Some healthy skepticism, you know, may be how they need to kind of approach interactions with the department and that kind of thing. But, you know, I think and you will be better judges of this than I will be, but I think, you know, your folks should also know that the department that was here 3 or 4 or 5 years ago was unacceptable, and the federal government recognized that, and we recognize that, and that's why we're here. You know, this is sort of like emergency surgery for a police department. We're not going anywhere until it's fixed, and the judge is not gonna go anywhere until something has actually, you know, sort of been baked into the culture of the department so that it's policing the community in the way that the community wants to be policed. So I guess the other general message I would give is that, you know, we're not going anywhere. There is a long way to go, but you know, we hope very much that things will continue to improve. Your second question has escaped me at the moment.
Racial impact statements and
Yeah,
tools like that.
I'm not sure that racial impact statements have been discussed yet, but I think one of the charges of the CPC is to explore some of those systemic reforms, even those that aren't necessarily required by the individual paragraphs of the consent decree, that may, you know, promote the values and objectives of the decree. So I would, this isn't sort of me dodging, but I think that they have taken up the mantle in sort of thinking about those systemic issues. They've made a lot of very good recommendations as to how to improve the kind of, the accountability system that city ordinances call for. You know, like the Office of Professional Accountability, where you go to complain about an officer, or the entity that sort of investigates officer misconduct. It was sort of created by the city council and the mayor a while ago, and the sort of system of ordinances and regulations sort of devolve into gobbledygook, where there are a lot of, there's a lot of ability for officer discipline to be mitigated, or a lot of bad outcomes because of the Byzantine nature of the system. And the CPC has addressed those issues by sort of, a number of pretty clear guidelines. So that's, a long way of saying I think that they are taking the lead right now, and I think deservedly so, given the role that they have in the consent decree, just thinking about what sort of systemic changes and reforms can be made, that can, make even more certain that the community is ideally served by this process. So I would refer you to them, because they may well have some things like that. Please.
Are you sort of the different, I don't know if they're exactly, or is that recently I've seen more make citizens move off the sidewalk. They both, I think actually the King bike cops are worse than the Seattle police ones, but there's certain forms of alienation or ways of not being interactive with.
Yeah, I think that Chief O'Toole has started to very strongly, tell her supervisors that you got to incentivize your folks to get out of the car, to talk to people, and to interact with folks, on the beat, on a daily basis, to make it a little bit less, I think when officers don't do that, when they stay in their cars or sort of, are on their bikes and gangs, I mean, that's sort of what makes you feel a little bit like this is some sort of removed, occupying force, unless, your police, part of your community. And I think she, has really started to hold supervisors accountable for that kind of thing. She has chosen to adopt this thing that is being called CSTAT, which is sort of, a way for the department to, in real time, assess sort of hot spots in crime and deploy resources to areas where there's been surges in particular types of crime. And that's sort of also informed, I think quite correctly in my view, by community input, where folks are complaining about crime or police conduct or a lack of police activity or that kind of thing. And I've been a few of those meetings, and it's really the senior brass of the department being pretty actively questioned by the chief herself about what's going on out there, why is it going on, what can we do about it. And I think one of the things that she constantly returns to is, well, what are your officers telling you about this? Who are they talking to? What did they say about what their concerns are? And I think that is sending a very powerful message across the department currently, that she expects officers not just to ride around for 8 hours in a car, but to be active eyes and ears for the department. But I think you're exactly right. The method and approach of officers when they're not responding to calls, merely on patrol, matters a lot. And I think the chief has seemed early on to understand that, and hopefully that will continue. Yes, sir.
You talked about having a way to go or a long way to go, and understandable that there'd be some resistance, some pushback in this process that you're talking about. And I wonder if you can talk about the resources and the leverage that you have when there is and the court has been since the monitoring has begun.
The DOJ is the U.S. Attorney's Office here has been incredibly involved in this process since just day one, and that hasn't changed since Jenny Durkin left as U.S. Attorney. But when she was U.S. Attorney, a particularly proactive and involved a part of the process. I think that matters a lot because they live here, they're here all the time, and can be a level of engagement that is different than if folks from the division in DC are only here sporadically. So I think that has mattered a lot, and they've been very heavily involved. Merrick and the judge talk frequently. He wants regular updates. He often, calls up after hearing sort of about the latest thing or reading the latest story in the LA Times and wants to know how that fits in with what we're doing. We appear before him from time to time in a formal way for folks to update him on how things are going. So he's incredibly involved, and I think his public statements in court and in formal documents have really revealed someone who wants to make sure that the process is promoting a unity of community, where the police department are seen not as, in a them, but as an us. That's sort of a paraphrase of one of his many sort of, quotes on the subject. And that's been very reassuring to us during the process. I think that it does require some investment of resources to move departments from where they are to where they should be. When we came in, despite the fact that apparently the training division was billing ungodly amounts of overtime, at least according to newspaper reports, there wasn't a lot of rigor behind it. The training programs had a lot of deficiencies and really needed to be entirely revamped. And obviously, creating new programs from whole cloth and to do the training and that kind of thing requires money and people. We're still in the very early stages of getting sort of the data infrastructure right. The IT department there has been a mess for a long time. I think everybody knew it, but it costs, not just to get the department to where it should be, it costs a lot to get them from where they are to sort of where any defensible public organization should be. It's a little bit of making up the gap that folks had allowed to fester there for a little bit too long, and that certainly requires, an outlay of resources. We are not in the business of compelling folks to say exactly, how much should be spent on this or how the priorities shake out. But I think we do make clear how certain things fit into, achieving full and effective compliance, how the department sort of, emerges from this being a world-class department. I mean, we sort of make those clear. And we've been reassured so far that folks on the city council and certainly the mayor have been very supportive of the process, have shown a commitment to the process, and at least to this point have really put their wallet where their mouth is in trying to make sure that the priorities of the consent decree are sort of the top priorities as far as funding is concerned. And so it's our hope and expectation that will continue. But it does cost money and entail a lot of manpower, a lot of human resources, a lot of time to get a department from being far behind where it should be with some deep troubles into something that can be sort of a model of contemporary urban policing, as the mayor has pledged it will be at the end of this. Yes, sir.
In regards to the decree, is that after they come out of the police academy that you're looking at these incidents? Because it seems like there's a gap between what the academy and then when they become a police officer. There's a big somewhere in there. And secondly is, you're saying that the questions that are being asked, what are the answers that the chiefs or giving the answers to O'Toole when she's asking? What answers are they giving her?
The answers that they're giving her are the answers that you expect folks who haven't questions all that often in the past to give. The "I'll look into that" or "yeah, we're changing that" sort of answers. But she keeps coming back to the same people every time, and I think is making the point by example by sort of singling out folks in those sort of meetings where she's holding feet to the fire, that she's expecting things to change, and that it's, I think for a long time, the SPD was a place where if there was an issue or a problem, someone asked about it, the way for your career was to give a really long answer, a lot of facts about how we got to this terrible place, how we got into this mess, and after a really long answer, just stop and not say what you're going to do about it, when you're going to die, what the follow-up is. There's not any internal accountability even in basic kind of problem solving and project management and sort of, addressing community concerns sort of venues. And I think that, I don't want to be too flippant about it, but, having someone return to the same questions and say, hey, you told me that last, nothing has changed. What are we really doing about it? Is a sort of culture from the top that I don't think we had seen, and I don't think the department had seen, previously. About the academy, one thing that's been encouraging, and I'm going to go in this, institutionalize this to really bake it into how the department works. It used to be that there wasn't a lot of conversation where sort of the state training academy, which is where, sort of the rookies get trained before they come on the force, and a lot of officers go for ongoing training. There was a lot of dialogue between that entity, which is a statewide entity, and Seattle. There was a lot of preference for sort of Seattle-only training, kind of, a little bit of the department being in a silo when it came to interacting with different approaches for training and different programs and that kind of thing. And in a number of areas, including force and the crisis intervention training that Ron was talking about, they've partnered very closely with the state academy, and with the state academy sort of agreeing to make some changes to curriculum and add some things, to accommodate the department's policies and viewpoints. And I think the department has kind of said, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here as often. So we're going to look to what the state academy is doing. We're going to look to what other states are doing. We're going to look to what other agencies and sort of, and I think, certainly within the academy, there's now, blocks of, there's some basic stuff that you just need to know how to do wherever you're a cop. But then there's a lot of stuff that is very department specific. And I know that the state, training academy has kept very close, tabs on the changes that have happened here, and are partnering with the department to incorporate that into the basic sort of training. I think which is encouraging. The department is also a little bit of an old department, and a lot of retirements recently, and I think you have a little bit better of a shot, in my view, when you're getting new folks who don't know any way but this new way on board, rather than sort of trying to get someone who was born and raised, so to speak, in a culture that had festered for too long, in the direction of unaccountability. I think it's an encouraging opportunity that the department is undergoing some demographic changes, because it will allow the department to really, from day one, instill sort of these new approaches, these new ways of partnering with the community and that kind of thing.
I actually had some questions, because I don't want to lie to them. I didn't at least try to answer one of their questions. But one of them, people want to know, when are the body cameras going to be implemented? That's really big with the community. They want to know that one. Another one is, are there any trainings that the Seattle police are going to start getting when it comes to dealing with African American males, like going into school and teaching children, from a young age, how to, when they come in contact with the police, how to act, since there has been the situation with the Fergusons and different things like that. I think that's a big discord with the relationship between with African American males.
Yeah, as to the second point, part of what I think we're going to insist upon quite strongly in the upcoming year of training is, not just generic training on how to communicate with people. To mention a little bit before, some communication training with specific regard to different community expectations and experiences. I mean, because you don't have to look very far if you go on Google to get into stuff about the fact that men and women communicate a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. African Americans and Latinos, police officers, in a slightly different way. If you're a first generation, we have a very different way of relating to institutional authority than a Caucasian man who, has never really thought twice about his the way that he interacts with police, right? I think that it can matter an awful lot, and I think that is rife with some challenges, but we think it's worth it to sort of have officers be armed with just a generic awareness that not everyone is going to respond to what you do out there in exactly the same way. I think that would be a step in the with respect to body cameras, I would say there is a test project that I gather is really going to be implemented soon here. There's been a lot of back and forth related to public disclosure issues and privacy issues, and there has been a very very recently, from the chief on this issue, and it's long overdue. We, enthusiastic, we worked very hard to get the department to use in-car video, which is better than nothing, but not as good as body cameras. And I think we will be pushing for them to push that out into the whole community just as soon as the pilot is over and they've made whatever adjustments they need to account for privacy interests, which is a very legitimate concern. But I think there are ways and policies and processes to account for that. So body cams are on the way.
So are we talking about 2015, 2016, or nobody knows the date, or it's just still on the talks level?
So there's going to be a pilot that I think starts at the end of November. So there will be a defined set of officers in a particular precinct.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to try to work out the kinks. I recall, and don't quote me on this, because I don't have the page, but I recall the target date for rolling them out a little bit more widely would be toward the end of 2015. That also requires, as he pointed out earlier, some resources. They're not outlandishly expensive, the individual units, but obviously you need to have the capacity to store all this video, and sort of administrative folks to be able to isolate video of interest and that kind of thing. But I do think that the conversation here, as it has in many other places, has gone from whether there should be body cams to just how to do it, which is a much better and more progressive conversation to be had.
And another question.
I love that you come armed with all this. Just like,
Oh, I couldn't
Right.
even begin to ask you. I had over 100 and some
love
questions,
it.
so I'm just picking some of the best ones
Good.
out. One of them is people have a big concern that here in Washington State there are not enough CPS officers of color. And how are you all going to change that? Because if people don't have someone that they can identify with, that has a lot to do with the trust issue as well.
Yeah, I think that has certainly been a post-Ferguson topic of conversation, and I think it's something that a lot of communities had identified even before that as being, a significant issue. I would actually have to get back to you on what specific steps the SPD is taking to adjust their outreach in order to attract more folks who not only represent sort of a wider array of communities in Seattle, but also who live in Seattle. A lot of officers who don't live in Seattle, they live in outlying areas, they commute in. And I think it's why you root for your hometown sports team. There's an allegiance there, you're part of that community. It matters when you live in the place that you're working. The chief has pointed out a few times that Boston, where she used to be the chief, actually had an ordinance that for at least the first so long of your career, you needed to live in order to be a police officer there, and she's noted that had made some sense to her. So I don't know how that directly will translate into recruiting efforts, but I think it sounds like she's on board with the importance of those concerns. Yes, ma'am.
You had mentioned trainings on implicit bias. Can you kind of share who are they targeting? When are they targeting? How often? Are we including more than just official trainings? Is there going to be sometimes I feel like people are extra quiet in official trainings, might be a little bit more talkative and less formal settings to have a dialogue about race.
Mhm.
I think, and LGBTQ, and gender identification issues. It, what exactly does that look like?
So the training that has been sort of approved by the court, and all of these things that I mentioned, the policies, the training, the procedures, the monitoring team gives our imprint on them. They do ultimately go to the judge, and he takes a close, hard look, and he sort of gives the final stamp of approval. Approved this training on implicit bias and bias-free policing. It is an in-class sort of course taught to groups of 28, I believe, and it's very intentionally sort of a random sample, if you will. It's not just first-year cops and in one training and supervisors in another. They're mixed. It tends to help kind of get some different perspectives. Folks with a lot of experience interacting with less seasoned officers. And that's sort of like the baseline introduction to this area. There are also trainings that are held at roll calls at the start of officer shifts. It's kind of, the rep is on TV, it's the everybody in the room getting talked at by the sergeant or the lieutenant. Those are often opportunities to say, here's an issue that's come up, to walk through it, and the department has developed sort of a series of trainings for direct supervisors to give on issues related to this area, to kind of keep coming back to these topics even when they've already maybe gone to one of the more intensive trainings. And I think it's very hard because this is such a challenging area and such an emerging area to cover all of the material that we might want in sort of a defined 8-hour training block. So I think the commitment that the department has made and has sort of been the foundation of us kind of approving this year's training is that, as I said before, it's the start. I think there's a lot of zeroing in that can happen as to particular responses, not just to implicit biases generally, but zooming in on the African American community, LGBTQ community, sort of things that are particularly applicable to particular communities in this area. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that sort of going forward. We really sort of we tried to make sure that these trainings are not the generic diversity trainings that many of us have to go through. Here is kind of an employment requirement, which some of them can be good, but many of them can be sort of generic, and so we've really tried to with the department that they're pressing officers, that their trainers are really not just taking the boilerplate kind of answers, but trying to get officers to engage in a discussion, and asking in some instances sort of provocative questions. Like, do you association between being black and crime? And in the training, the test training that I attended, one of the officers said, well, no, I don't really think that. And then a sergeant said, you have to be kidding me. Of course it's like, even if we don't want that to be the case, that is something that we need to deal with, right? And it engendered a conversation that even if it doesn't change everybody's mind and they don't buy into it, cops can be a tough crowd sometimes to give training to. And getting them to think a little bit more closely about issues and how it might actually affect them on the street is an important part of the beginning of the process. That's what that training is also sort of geared toward.
Has it already started? How
It
many
has.
people have been trained?
It actually started on Monday, and all officers will have received that training by the end of the year. So.
In 2014.
The training schedule has been very aggressive because we felt that the policies on paper were worthless until officers actually knew how it translated to them on the street. So by the end of this year, as I say, 32 hours of use of force training, beginning 8 hours in these areas, with more training to come in early 2015. been a strong commitment on the part of everyone toward training.
I just have
Yeah.
one thing that I want to raise. We talk about community, and I'm someone who walks all around this city. I live somewhere off of East, so I walk through the corridor. And I also walk through it during the day. I'm surprised when I do see police officers who are off their bicycles. But I never see them really engage people that they're walking by. There's no like hello throughout the day, nothing. And I think for this to work, if we're talking about respect and developing a rapport, that has to happen. And I'm just curious how that training is coming about, people actually engaging with people to get to know the community, whether it be in the central area, whether it be in the south end of town,
Yeah,
or the
I-
university district.
Yeah, I hear you. I technically live in New York. Really live here. And we, because we're here so much, and because it's have sort of an apartment in Capitol Hill, and I walk around a bit and visit various parts of the city and see sights and all that sort of thing. I have yet to have an interaction with an SPD officer, and I've been here for a year and a half. It troubles me. I didn't see an SPD officer when I walked from the Paramount Theater, saw a concert on a Wednesday night, up to where we are, which is some distance away in Capitol Hill. I didn't see a police car or a police officer, and that's a problem that has not gone unnoticed by many of us on the team anecdotally. All I can say is that the current chief is the first who has, in a very public way, said that that's a problem, and I am optimistic that is something that she will back up with action. I think as to how officers engage the community, I'm hopeful that these ongoing sort of trainings in these areas related to communication skills and that sort of thing will provide some tools to get officers to think about approaches to the community that aren't, I'm a police officer and you're a member of the community, I have to do this, but just more like I patrol here all the time, I need to know you. Our relationship might be very valuable to the both of us someday. I want to know a little bit about you. You should know a little bit about me. I think that's important. I mean, officers work similar watches in the same precinct. It's not like they're roving around the city indiscriminately. They can develop ties with folks on their own that can advance engagement with the wider community all the time. So I hope that the training will provide some of the skills and impetus, but I also hope that increasingly the chief and her sort of vision for what officers are doing will be imprinted a little bit more on the department. Yes, one more question.
One more, sorry. You just really triggered
Yeah.
something with me that's been bothering me for quite a while, especially you're mentioning the Paramount. And there's like one off-duty police officer who's paid to be there that I see all the time. He has this badge blacked out. He's got a cigar in his hand.
I think we saw the same guy.
He's not a good representative of and especially having I've seen him hassle people and having his name badge blacked out. It just seems like should be antithetical to everything.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't.
He's got tape over it, and I've heard from other criminal defense lots of times narcotics cops will do that.
Issues that's a pretty live issue. I'm told there's an article about it in the Seattle Times. Is the issue of secondary employment. And officers sort of getting side gigs to provide security at places and that kind of thing. I think it's been historically a problem within SPD that folks have known about, but it's a dicey issue. Folks supplementing their incomes, and sort of taking that away can be challenging. I think it's an area that I know that the chief likes to say that in front of her apartment building in downtown, there's always a guy directing traffic. And she's like, I don't know who you are and what our relationship is to you. You know, there's some lack of clarity as to the full scope of that relationship between folks who are providing those services and the department itself. And I think I don't think this is out of school, but from what I know to be the case, there will be some action to clarify that when you're an SPD, regardless of where you're working and what you're doing, you're still an SPD officer and obligated to follow the SPD's rules and that kind of thing. And I think that's a huge step in the right direction, because it can't be the case that you follow one set of rules when you're on the job during the day, and then when you take on security at a Seahawks game, you're under another set of rules. So there'll be some greater clarity soon on that. I'm violating my one more question.
Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I actually have 2 questions. Sorry, I will make them quick.
Yeah.
I was wondering, it's my understanding of the reporting system is that it's entirely self-reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you could address any concerns about the fact that this is entirely self-reported, and also that the internal mechanisms are completely internal to the SPD.
Mm-hmm.
And then my second question is, it's been a really long time since I read the consent decree, but I seem to remember that there was a finding that police officers were kind of punitively responding to
Mm-hmm.
citizens, either talking to them or filming them while they were on the job. And I was wondering if there's been any First Amendment training around those issues.
There has been some First Amendment training, in the context of rather oddly getting officers up to speed on the in-car video and body camera policies, because obviously, there's some First Amendment kind of, issues at play with the use of those technologies. I'm not sure that there's been any direct training yet on that. With respect to kind of just retaliation against citizens for filming or that kind of thing, I think that there are new policies. They're not new policies, but they've been dramatically upgraded to emphasize that sort of retaliatory actions against anyone, for engaging in lawful behavior, retaliatory allegations against retaliatory behavior because folks internal to the SPD have made allegations that you did something wrong. That sort of thing is completely unacceptable and carries with it a much more substantial kind of review behind it, and sort of what can happen to you is much more, I think, drastic and defined than it was before. With respect to the self-reporting issue, that is an issue. One of the reasons that body cameras are so interesting is that it sort of allows for the opportunity to kind of know a little bit more about what an officer is doing at all times, and to be able to cross a bit. But that's obviously time consuming to go through a bunch of boring video to see if there was something that happened that wasn't reported. We are, in addition to sort of providing real-time monitoring, we look at sort of the department's performance over, on a systemic level over a chunk of time. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at very soon is which is the underreporting of force. Are people complaining that officers have used excessive force? When the department goes to look and see if there are any records, there isn't any. That may be a problem, obviously, right? There are a few other mechanisms more bureaucratic than that to try to, on their, if they were dispatched somewhere with something going on and there's no other report related to that incident, if there are especially high rate of that, we might have concerns that there are things going on in that interaction that aren't being reported. I mean, one thing that all officers do is radio in where they are and sort of initially, you know, if they're initiating with a civilian or a subject, that they're doing because they obviously want for folks to know if something bad. So it's rarely the case that officers are making a contact where there isn't some, you know, indication that they are, you know, doing something. There's sort of a collection of things that we're going to look at to make sure that underreporting isn't happening. But my sense is that you know, officers generally are not. Officers are generally complaining that they have to report too much at this point, which isn't really the case. The other thing that's complete nonsense, and if you hear, you are hereby allowed to debunk loudly, is the notion that it's taking officers too long to do this paperwork. It's taking time off the street. It's not appreciably more complicated. You know, it's not more complicated than filling out sort of a, you know, you're arriving at a new doctor's office. You sort of sit there for a while and check some boxes and write some descriptions of you and your conditions and that kind of thing. I think there are some growing pains when you go from a department that has never self-reported or been held to account for self-reporting and go into very rigorous reporting, so officers aren't used to that. But the paperwork is very consistent. It's not even paperwork anymore, it's all automated. It's a computer-based system, and the software platform is used by more than 400 law enforcement agencies across the country. If it works for 400 other police agencies and isn't taking their folks off the street, I think it can work for Seattle as well if officers sort of put their heads down and you know, sort of commit to this being kind of the way it is, even if it wasn't like it before, and kind of, you know, move on and get on with the work of keeping the community safe. So with that, thank you very much again for having us. Merrick, apologizes for not being able to be here in person.
Thanks to
but
Matthew.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you very
much appreciated. Thanks to all of you for coming. And thank you for all your questions. I'm Dan.
I graduated from the original
That's on you.
from the Bronx.
Oh, really? Which program?
I have an early morning
Relationships and
call me.
They do their thing. They information out that they feel.
How are you? How are you? Good to see you too. I got your phone, but I